Hey everybody, it's Jason Youngblood, the author of The Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer, and this is episode 5. So in episode 3, we talked about Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States. I believe we actually touched on Woodrow Wilson in episode 2 and then Franklin Roosevelt in episode 3. But I wanted to spend some time in episode 5 before we move on to the other claims of the critic Matt Novak about how Napoleon Hill was a fraud and never knew any of the benefactors or the famous or wealthy benefactors that he claimed to know, and also had many business failures as well as many failed marriages. And because of that, he was a fraud and a scammer and a charlatan and was not legitimate in his claims to know the secrets to success. And so I just wanted to spend some time in episode 5 here to talk a little bit more about Woodrow Wilson before we go into our next claim, which is digging deeper into Andrew Carnegie. So I'm going to pull up the article from Matt Novak real quick and just recap on his claim. I'm going to share my screen here. Uh, so this is the article, Napoleon Hill, the greatest self-help scammer of all time. And just to recap on his claim, he says that if you pull up the website of Napoleon Hill Foundation or flip through the official biography of Hill released in 1995, it's hard not to be impressed by the man's supposed accomplishments. He was said to be an advisor to two presidents, Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who even claimed that he came up with FDR's most famous phrase, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And then down here, he caps it off by saying Hill was a charlatan through and through. In fact, there's no evidence whatsoever that Hill met President Wilson or President Roosevelt. So I was thinking about that in between today in episode 4 and wanted to actually go through all of the evidence of how he knew President Wilson and then also all the evidence of how he knew President Roosevelt. So I'm actually going to minimize this and bring up my other document here of all of Hill's associations that connect him with Woodrow Wilson. So I'll share my screen again and pull up that document. And if you can see here, this is how Napoleon Hill knew President Woodrow Wilson. And so these are all the different associations that Hill verifiably had that prove or at least strongly indicate that he knew President Wilson. So the first one here is going to be Samuel Insull. And so if we look at Hill's draft card, I'm going to pull that up here as well. If we look at Hill's draft card, which is in the Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer. So this is a copy of his draft card. I'm just going to minimize this real quick so that you can see it clearly. And so it's highlighted, and then we can see the actual text below. So this is Napoleon Hill, his address 6739 Dorchester in Chicago, Illinois. His birthday, October 26, 1883. He's 35. On September 18th, or September 12th, 1918. And then, so his draft card doesn't say that he's deployed to World War One. It says that he was assigned to be the social director in munitions plans for the Winslow Brothers Company. So in my research, I found out that the Winslow Brothers Company was actually a munitions plant that built materials and equipment for the war. And Samuel Insull was stationed there as a part of the Illinois Council of Defense. So President Wilson actually created all these different state councils of defense, and Illinois was one of the major ones. And Samuel Insull worked in the Wilson administration as the head of the Illinois Council of Defense. And it was at the Illinois Council of Defense where Napoleon Hill worked for Samuel Insull. And so he says in his writings, and so you can't just kind of take a snapshot of him just saying, "Hey, I knew President Woodrow Wilson." You really have to delve into his other writings and lectures to hear him tell it for himself, his connections with Woodrow Wilson. And the connection that he says he had is with Samuel Insull. Samuel Insull was working for the Winslow Brothers Company, and he was making sure that they were producing the war materials successfully. And this is where Andrew Carnegie, or sorry, Napoleon Hill worked for Samuel Insull there. And further down, you'll even see articles in the book on what the Winslow Brother companies did, and just further indicating and verifying that they built equipment for the war. So that is a very light connection. But it's one of the major ones because if you look up who Samuel Insull was, you see that Napoleon Hill knew him very well. He talks about him in several of his books, several of his writings, but he was also in the Wilson administration. The second person that I want to talk to you about is Thomas Marshall. So if we look up Thomas Marshall, I believe he's on page 256 in the book. He was the vice president under President Wilson. So here's the actual vice president under President Wilson. And not only is he the vice president for President Wilson, he also writes a letter of how to sell your services in Napoleon Hill's book that was written and released in 1917. So you can see here the actual book. And if I blow this up, which we went over this in episode 2, you can see that it says, with valuable advice from, among other people, Thomas R. Marshall. So this is personal advice. He wrote to these people and asked them to include a letter. It wasn't just a general letter that he got from the library. These were personal letters written specifically for this book, How to Sell Your Services. And he asked these people through his association with them for their input and contribution on how to sell your services so that he could put it in his book that was released in 1917. And so Thomas Marshall was the vice president under Woodrow Wilson. And then if we go to the next person on the list, which is Samuel Gompers, very funny name, but Samuel Gompers was the president of the American Federation of Labor. And he also was appointed by President Wilson to the National Council of Defense, just like Samuel Insull was appointed by President Wilson to the Illinois Council of Defense. Samuel Gompers, who was the president of the American Federation of Labor, was appointed to be on the National Council of Defense. And so you can see here, this is an ad from Napoleon Hill advertising the law of success, and Samuel Gompers actually writes an endorsement for the law of success. Mastery of the law of success is the equivalent of an insurance policy against failure. This is a nationally syndicated newspaper, and this is not the only article or the only local newspaper that published this, but it was published in New York City on November 15th of 1928. There's several articles of this quote from Samuel Gompers, and Samuel Gompers is known to be a close associate of President Woodrow Wilson. So just imagine somebody lying on somebody and saying, "Hey, I know this very famous and prestigious and wealthy person that was a former president," and that person still being alive and knowing personally the person that knows that person with no pushback and no hesitation whatsoever from these people. So we have evidence that he knows Samuel Gompers in the Wilson administration. We have evidence that he knows Samuel Insull in the President Wilson administration as well too. And we have evidence that he knew Thomas Marshall in the Wilson administration, actually the vice president of the Wilson administration. We go on to the next person. This one is a key person in evidence that he knew President Wilson, and this is going to be John Davis. So John Davis was, let me see my notes here. He was the Solicitor General for the Wilson administration and also the U.S. Ambassador to the UK. So let me just find him real quick. Okay. So this is a picture of John W. Davis. I'll minimize my screen here. And hopefully you guys can see all of this. This is a picture of him. And so there's a few different connections here. So first of all, during the Wilson administration, like I said, he was the Solicitor General and he was United States Ambassador to the UK under President Wilson. Now, he was also from a town called Clarksburg, West Virginia. Now, Clarksburg is where Napoleon Hill's second wife, Florence, Florence was from. She was from Lumberport, West Virginia. And Clarksburg and Lumberport are twin cities, almost kind of like Akron and Canton are in Ohio, or Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas are. So Clarksburg and Lumberport. So they were from the same town. He is a family friend of Florence's family. This is how he met John Davis, okay? Because they both lived in Clarksburg or Lumberport, West Virginia, which is essentially the same town. They're from the same area. And then in 1924, this gentleman, John Davis, runs for president. And then I actually have newspaper articles of Napoleon Hill campaigning for John Davis for president in 1924. At the time, Napoleon Hill was president of the Metropolitan Business College of Cleveland, and he stopped being the president of the Metropolitan Business College of Cleveland in order to campaign for John Davis's run for president. So not only was he associated with the former U.S. Ambassador to the United Kingdom in the Wilson administration and the Solicitor General in the Wilson administration, he also helped him run for president by campaigning for him. And this gentleman, John Davis, was a family friend of his wife's family. The other person that we are going to talk about here, we talked about for him being the Secretary of Commerce under the Roosevelt administration, but he was also in the Wilson administration as well too, and that is Daniel C. Roper. Remember that name because he's not only proof that Napoleon Hill knew President Franklin Roosevelt, he's also proof that he knew President Woodrow Wilson. So Daniel C. Roper, we take a look at his profile. So you'll see here, this is an ad for advertising. This is a newspaper article advertising Napoleon Hill School, the International Success University. And you'll see right here, Daniel C. Roper presided as chairman of the meeting to promote Napoleon Hill's internal or International Success University. And then we also talked about how William C. Grace, who was in the Roosevelt administration, he was on the board of the National Recovery Administration, which was in charge of getting the country out of the Great Depression, is actually the president of Napoleon Hill's College International Success University. But Daniel C. Roper is not only chairman of the meeting for Napoleon Hill School, and he's not only Secretary of Commerce for President Roosevelt, he was also the Commissioner of Internal Revenue in the Wilson administration. And you'll see that I have that listed here, and this is all verifiable. So he's the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue. So here's another friend in President Wilson ally that we can see that Napoleon Hill knew. So it's verified that he knew people who were direct friends and associates of President Wilson. I'm going to go through a few more people, and you can see the full list here. I'll just stop sharing this for a second. That way you can see my list of people here, and I'll share this with anybody who wants to actually possess it or have it. Is you have Samuel Insull, you have Thomas Marshall, you have Samuel Gompers, you have John Davis, William Jennings Bryan, James Champ Clark, Adrian B. Tolley, and then we actually go into actually how he knew President Wilson directly through Andrew Carnegie as well too. So next on the list, so we have Samuel Gompers, we have John Davis as well too. And then William Jennings Bryan was President Wilson's Secretary of State. So this is the Secretary of State under the Wilson administration. But when we pull back up How to Sell Your Services, you'll see that he actually wrote a letter that was included in that book as well too. So if you take a good look at that picture, I can send that picture to anybody who asks. If you just message me on the Gospel of Napoleon Hill Scholar or Scammer Facebook page, there's a picture of the actual book that was printed and released and published in 1917. William Jennings Bryan is one of the contributors to Napoleon Hill's book. Also, another contributor to that book, How to Sell Your Services, is James Beauchamp Clark. He was known as Champ Clark. Guess what? He was Speaker of the House during the Wilson administration. He wrote a letter that was included in How to Sell Your Services. Not only that, and I think the strongest evidence here is going to be Thomas Marshall because he was vice president, and Samuel Gompers as well too, because we actually have an endorsement from him in a Hill ad promoting the law of success, and we know that he was in President Wilson's National Council of Defense. But here is possibly the strongest evidence that he knew President Wilson is that Adrian B. Tolley was the official White House calligrapher. Now, he got that job starting with the Wilson administration because he was the calligrapher for decades and decades and decades. But the person that hired him first to be the official calligrapher, which is to design all of the outgoing invitations to the White House, was President Woodrow Wilson. And the first job he ever had being the calligrapher for the White House was designing President Wilson's wedding invitations. And then we see this article that I'm going to pull up here, where now his only job is to design invitations to the White House. But you know what else he designed? Napoleon Hill's 48th birthday party invitations as well too in 1931. 1931. So I'm going to pull that up and show you that article as well. So if I share my screen again, I'll read through this. And I read through this the other day, but I'll read through it again. So official court is supposed to say calligrapher, it says choreographer of White House honor. All right. And so you'll see there the Success Club of Washington held its regular semi-monthly dinner and dance last night at the Highlands. This meeting developed into a surprise party for the founder of this club, Mr. Napoleon Hill, on the occasion of his birthday. He was turning 48 years old. At a previous meeting, resolutions were passed by the members commending Mr. Hill on the work that he was doing in teaching the law of success, which resolutions were beautifully engrossed by Mr. Adrian B. Tolley, the well-known government penman who engrosses the White House invitations and presented to Mr. Hill. A large birthday cake was placed before Mr. Hill with 17 candles, typifying the 17 laws of success as taught by Mr. Hill. All right, so the birthday party invitations were actually designed by Adrian B. Tolley, who only designed the White House invitation parties and meetings. All right. And then just the last few people here, I'll go back to the list and show you the full list. So after an Adrian Tolley here, we'll see here how he actually first met Woodrow Wilson. And then that brings us to some of the other people that we should talk about, which is William Rainey Harper. Remember that name. And then also David Starr Jordan and Frank Vanderlip. So who were these people besides Woodrow Wilson? So William Rainey Harper was a trustee for the Carnegie Foundation. All right. And the Carnegie Foundation was a group of college presidents who started really the first annuity. So they were really investing into something that could grow their money so that it could help teachers actually have some retirement funds or some future funds as well, too, outside of just their pay from the schools. And so these were all college presidents. William Rainey Harper was the president of the University of Chicago. He was also famously associated with John D. Rockefeller. Napoleon Hill writes about him several times throughout his writings. So he's not just name dropping Henry Ford, Andrew Carnegie, Thomas Edison. A lot of the people who Napoleon Hill name drops are no names, people that nobody has ever heard of. But if you look them up, you'll see that they're actually associated with the people that he claims to know as well too. So this person, the reason how he got to be president of the University of Chicago is from a nomination from John Rockefeller. Okay, John D. Rockefeller, one of the wealthiest titans in American history. And not only that, he was also on the board of the Carnegie Foundation. Another person on the board of Carnegie Foundation was David Starr Jordan. Now, David Starr Jordan not only was the president of Stanford, but he was actually the founding president of Stanford. He founded the university. Okay. He was president of the college from 1891 to 1913. He was also a trustee of the Carnegie Foundation. And then if I stop sharing for just one moment and then show you in the Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer. This is on page 693. So if you'll see here, this is a significant figure here for a couple of reasons. So David Starr Jordan, all right, he actually writes an endorsement for Napoleon Hill's Law of Success. David Starr Jordan, president of Stanford University and member of the Carnegie Foundation. Napoleon Hill has produced what I believe to be the first practical philosophy of achievement. Given an endorsement to Napoleon Hill, all right. Its major distinguishing feature is the simplicity in which it has been presented. So he's actually writing an endorsement for the law of success. This president of Stanford University, friend of Andrew Carnegie, on the board of the Carnegie Foundation, along with William Rainey Harper and Woodrow Wilson. And you'll see that if I share the list again. And this is where he first met Woodrow Wilson. So it wasn't like he was just saying, like, hey, I'm just a person that's a college president, because he was president of a college called Napoleon Hill Institute at the time when Woodrow Wilson actually put him into the Illinois Council of Defense with Samuel Insull. So it's not like he's a no name. He actually met Woodrow Wilson while he was the president of Princeton. So before he was president, he was actually the governor of New Jersey. There's Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson. So before he was president of the United States in 1913, he was the governor of New Jersey, and before that, he was the president of Princeton College. This is where Napoleon Hill met him as president of Princeton College, while he was a trustee for the Carnegie Foundation as a college president. Andrew Carnegie introduced him to Woodrow Wilson. And we know this because all of these people who he says he knows, I mean, we're talking about 1908, 1909. Either he was really squirrely at getting into the Dewey Decimal System in the library and learning of all the trustee members who was on the Carnegie Foundation and having a story that he made up for how he knew each one of them, not just Andrew Carnegie. I mean, this is a really elaborate diabolical plan of of Napoleon Hill to just prove that he knew Andrew Carnegie by not only saying, "Hey, I knew Andrew Carnegie," but also looking up all of his no-name associates as well too, and having a story for how he met them. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson is on the board of the Carnegie Foundation as well too, and he met him in 1909. He didn't meet him while he was president. So he's not just saying, "Hey, I was an advisor in the Wilson administration." He met him before he was even famous or nationally known. All right. And we have David Starr Jordan. And the last person, and this more so has to do with Andrew Carnegie than Woodrow Wilson, is Frank Vanderlip. So I'm going to show you an article that has all these people listed who were on the board of the Carnegie Foundation. This is where we know Woodrow Wilson, because not only that, he knew other people on the board. He knew William Rainey Harper. He also knew David Starr Jordan, and he knew Frank Vanderlip. So if I go back to the Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer. And then if I pull up the page that talks about yeah, that talks about the Carnegie Foundation. So this is a newspaper article telling you who the trustees are, and you'll see that they're all college presidents. All right, so Andrew Carnegie established his fund for pensions for college professors. So this is for pensions for college professors. This is really kind of like an annuity or a retirement fund for presidents of colleges. So you'll see President A.T. Hadley of Yale University, and it goes on down the list. I highlight President William R. Harper because there's a whole section on him and how Napoleon Hill knew him, and Napoleon Hill writing about him. President Woodrow Wilson is included in that. So this is another person. It makes sense. It all connects of how he not only knew Woodrow Wilson, but how Napoleon Hill knew Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie, he lists several of these people and that he knew them as well too. So while he is president of Princeton University, also David Starr Jordan, and you'll read down here that on page 13 of Thinking Grow Rich, Hill lists David Starr Jordan as one of the men who he analyzed as part of his research for Andrew Carnegie. So he lists David Starr Jordan, even in Think and Grow Rich, as somebody that he knew. He knew him through Andrew Carnegie because he was on the board of the Carnegie Foundation. And then we find this gentleman here, F.A. Vanderlip, or Frank A. Vanderlip of New York. He was the former president of National City Bank, but he was also on the executive committee of the Carnegie Foundation. So just going back to my list, I mentioned him because he Napoleon Hill talks a lot about Frank Vanderlip. Okay, so I'll show you the section where he talks about Frank Vanderlip in the Gospel of Napoleon Hill Scholar or Scammer, but it's more so evidence that he knew Andrew Carnegie. So let me just go right back to that, and then I will end the video before we talk again next time on episode 6. So let me just find that section very quickly. All right. So here, and I'll just blow this up a little bit and I'll just read this paragraph. So Arthur Shelton is who we're talking about here. So both Napoleon Hill and Arthur Shelton have been members of the Rotary Club of Chicago. All right, around this time that he left the Betsy Ross Candy Company, so you'll read about that when you read the book about Hill's business that failed the Betsy Ross Candy Company. Hill had asked Arthur Shelton if he could shadow him and study his success. So Hill looked up to Arthur Shelton, and Arthur Shelton wrote books about how to be successful in sales. And so he asked him, "Hey, can I be your shadow and study you, and will you be my mentor?" Sheldon obliged and began to teach Hill about salesmanship. In fact, Sheldon was so influential on Hill that he dedicated his book, How to Sell Your Services, to him, stating that Sheldon had inspired the writing of the book. So we'll pause there for a second. So this is page 355. And then let me just pull up How to Sell Your Services again and just show you where he says that in that book. So if I show you a picture of that book and blow that up, let me just show you what he writes here in the opening flap of the book. So this is the opening page or the opening contents of How to Sell Your Services. And down at the bottom, after he lists off letters of advice from Andrew Carnegie, Frank A. Vanderlip, William J. Bryan, John D. Rockefeller, Thomas Marshall, Vice President of Woodrow Wilson, Thomas A. Edison, Champ Clark, Speaker of the House. Okay. He says, this book is dedicated to my fan, Arthur Frederick Shelton, who did much to inspire the writing of this book. So let me go back. All right. So at this time, Shelton operated a school for boys, which was in desperate need of money. As Shelton's friend or mentee, Hill took it upon himself to ask Andrew Carnegie's associate, Frank Vanderlip, to provide the money. So he has this whole story of how he knew Frank Vanderlip, which is the executive on the who was on the executive committee of the Carnegie Foundation. So he's creating a whole nother story with somebody else. He's either really maniacal and really intelligent and a diabolical genius, or he was telling the truth. So here's another story to where he is the mentee of a guy named Arthur Shelton, an author who writes books on salesmanship and says, "Hey, you need money for your school for boys. I'm going to ask Frank Vanderlip, who is a wealthy banker, not Andrew Carnegie. He could have easily name dropped Andrew Carnegie. He name dropped Frank Vanderlip, who's on the executive committee of the Carnegie Foundation, and asked him to help Sheldon out with the money for the school for boys." After Vanderlip agreed, Hill eagerly sent a telegram to Sheldon to relay the exciting news. However, Sheldon angrily replied, this is kind of an embarrassing story for Napoleon Hill because he puts himself out there and tries to help out Sheldon. But Sheldon replies, "Since when did you become my authorized manager?" All right. So this actually caused a rift between Arthur Shelton and Napoleon Hill because Shelton seemed very unappreciative for Napoleon Hill trying to help him fund this school for boys. And so you'll see there that my full list, I'll share it again, of all the associations that Napoleon Hill had with Woodrow Wilson. There are a lot here. This is not just a paper thin, evidence or paper thin verification of him knowing Woodrow Wilson. We have several different people that he has stories on how he knew them, that when you look them up, they are very close with President Wilson or in his administration. All right. So when we talk in episode 6, we'll talk a little bit more about Andrew Carnegie and how he knew him and even more evidence in those connections, because the same thing is true of him. He doesn't just name drop Andrew Carnegie, he name drops other people where there's newspaper clippings and historical data proving his relationship with those people. And then we have other newspaper clippings that prove their relationship with Andrew Carnegie. So I just wanted to share that with you. If you'd like a copy of this full list, that way you can do the research on your own and independently and find out who these people are, verify their association with Woodrow Wilson, and verify their association with Napoleon Hill. They're all through his writings and lectures. Just message me on the Gospel of Napoleon Hill Scholar or Scammer Facebook page. We'll talk about episode 6 next time. I appreciate you guys watching. Yeah, and just let me know if you have any other questions about any of his associations or any other rumors that you have possibly heard about him being a fraud, scammer, or a charlatan, or a fake, or a phony. Please either comment under this video or message me directly on the Facebook page. All right, until then, thanks, guys.